Do your lexical abilities depend on your genes? Well, obviously, no, since the word you use are not specified by your genes, but have to be learned. Since our genes is something that we carried from our parents naturally, or we inherit from our parents naturally, while lexical abilities is something that we should learn of. However, the biocognitive substrate of word learning as well as of word use do seem to be affected at least in part by genetic factors. Twin studies of children suggest that aspects of lexical acquisition as measured by the size of children's spoken vocabulary are strong influenced by genetic factors. Well, yes, it is also true, since as with many genetic effects, the influence of genetics on vocabulary becomes stronger as we get older. So parang lumalabas lang yung genetic effects once we get older. However, it is important to out that in all of these studies, children's surrounding environment plays an important role too. It's not just only in genes. Yes, it is true. We should not always focus on genes. We should also need to focus on teaching our children on what are the things or the happenings about their surroundings or their environment. Moreover, it is not yet clear to what extent these genetic influences might be specific to lexical abilities. Thus, specific language impairment or SLI says that in which has an important genetic basis is typically accompanied by impairments in lexical retrieval, which is through lexical knowledge in children with disorder. So, in overall in this topic, the evidence suggests that genetic as well as the environment factors have an important influence on lexical acquisition and processing. Next, separability. First, let's define what is separability. Separability is something that is capable of being separated or able to split into parts. In here, in separability, even if we restrict our focus to the lessons, this appears to be substantial separability among different linguistic functions. The lexically related functions are divided into different conceptual categories, which is the frontal regions for verbs and the temporal regions for nouns. However, we should always keep in mind that this separability does not imply that any of the brain structures that underline the various lexical functions are subserved only to these functions. Next, are biological substrate of lexical abilities domain specific? Well, not surprisingly, since there is little, if any, good evidence that the biocognitive substrate of lexical abilities are dedicated to language. In contrast, there is increasing evidence for biocognitive and biocognitive association between lexical and non-linguistic conceptual semantic functions, sug- mm, suggesting that these functions depend on common substrate. So it is difficult in principle to demonstrate domain specificity, since one might show double dissociations between lexical processing and attention between lexical processing, and motor functions. Thus, HM or hectometer and other amnesics are severely impaired at remembering not only new words but also new facts. And personally, it is an experience event. A biocognitive perspective on lexicon and grammar, the declarative and procedural model. The basic premise of declarative and procedural model is that language depends on two well-studied brain memory systems that had been implicated in non-language functions in animals and human, which is the declarative and the procedural model. The declarative model or memory is is a system subserves the learning, representation, and use of knowledge about the facts and events. Also, it is strongly predicted to play specific role and in mental lexicon, while the procedural memory is the memory that underlined the implicit learning of new and control the long established motor and cognitive skills and habit, especially in those involving sequences. It is also less accessible to conscious awareness and enables gradual learning of habits and skills, including the sequencing, navigation, and probabilistic categorization. Okay, let's come back in here first. The declarative memory is also called a explicit learning, while the procedural is called implicit learning. In linguistics, syntax is defined as the arrangement of words in sentences, clauses, and phrases, while in biocognition of syntax, it is still less well understood than that if the lexicon, conceptual semantics, or phonology. This is perhaps not surprising given the particular complexity of syntax. Nevertheless, the evidence thus far has begun to shed light on a variety of questions, including the function of neuroanatomy of syntax, the spatiothermal dynamics of syntactic processing, and the biocognitive separability and domain specificity of these linguistic functions. Broca's region is important for syntax. First of all, an area called uh, Broca's region clearly plays an important role in syntactic processing. Broca's region are stated with directing the process that leads the speech to utterance. This region seems to encompass not only Broca's area itself, the but also extend to Broca's area 47 and back to the frontal upper column. Numerous neuroimaging studies have found activation within this region during receptive language tasks engaging syntactic processing. Um, what First, let's discuss what is the frontal upper column. Frontal upper column is the process of analyzing natural language with the rule of formal grammar. Formal grammar. Broca's region is also implicated in expressive language, that is, activation increase within syntactic complicity. Next. Okay, this image. This one picture on the black and white color are the left lateral left lateral view of the cerebrum, showing greater activation for the production of sentences as compared to word or list. These two overlapping cross-hatch area of activation, which encompass BA44 and the frontal upper column, reflects two experiments that use the same stimuli on the different sets of subjects. In Broca's area, in, it has the it involves the production of speech and sound. In the other side of the picture, this is the part of the brain which is the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe it involves the speech, the behavior, memory, hearing, as well as the vision. Overall, the Broca's area are essential for language production. Studies of adult onset brain damage also suggest a rule for Broca's region in syntax. Adult onset means the beginning during adulthood. Acute adult onset lesions of Broca's area and surrounding cortex is associated with agrammatism, that is syntactically and morphologically simplified speech. Agrammatism is a difficulty with using basic grammars and syntax or word orders and sentence structures. Agrammatism seems to have an especially difficult time with linguistic structures and morphemes that depend on functional categories which are higher in hierarchy. The patients with the syntactic impairments of agrammatic patients are not limited to expressive language. Patients with agrammatism are also called patients with agrammatic aphasia, which means patients who are often able to use context words like nouns and verbs. These patients are often have substantial difficulty in receptive language, particularly in using syntactic structure to understand the sentence. So those patients are they have quite confusion, or it is quite complicated for them to understand the syntactic structures. Next, evidence from developmental disorder or implicates Broca's area in syntax. Children with specific language impairment or SLI who have particular abnormalities in Broca's area have a wide range of syntactic impairments in both speech and comprehension. Like in agrammatic patients, these children who have SLI seems to have particular trouble with morphemes that depends on the higher functional categories. So those children, they are quite also confused with the morphemes that has a higher function categories. It is important to point out that not all of Broca's regions subserves the same syntactic functions. Rather, different subregions seems to have roles. Although the evidence, um, evidence to date does not allow one to draw unambiguous conclusions about the precise function of the particular parts of Broca's region, certain parts are beginning to or starting to emerge. Next, understanding sentences, the movie. The spatiotemporal dynamics of syntax have mainly been studied in sentence comprehension. What do you mean by spatiotemporal dynamics? It is a recurrent interactive model whereby an initial feed-forward swept through the ventral stream to prefrontal cortex is followed by recurrent interactions. As in word production, our understanding of words spatiothermal dynamics of sentence comprehension derives from many different sources of evidence, including the studies of brain damage patient, uh, hemodynamic or bemodynamic neuroimaging, ERP, MEG, and psycholinguistic studies. ERP means the event-related potentials, while MEG is for megabyte. However, because of syntactic processing, here in understanding the sentence, the processing is extremely complex. A clear understanding of it has yet emerged, and different researchers have interpreted the data in somewhat different ways. Here, when you hear each word in a sentence, your brain first performs phonological processing in order to identify the word form and which point syntactic processing begins. Here, we present the data on auditory sentence comprehension in light to the most comprehensive neurocognitive interpretation. Next, at this point, the lexical entry can be accessed, allowing the subsequent morphosyntactic and semantic integration. Both of these process to take a place about 300 to 500 milliseconds after word onset. Morphosyntactic is morphosyntactic integration, which involves the area of Broca's area 44 perhaps extending to Broca's area 45. It reflects in LAN, which means the left anterior negativity. This component is elicited by morphosyntactic violations. Mm, while semantic integrations, on the other hand, relies on temporal lobe region. In the final stage, processing the word within the ongoing sentence, any ambiguities or error are sorted out in order to arrive at the final syntactic structures and semantic interpretations. Um, for example, mm, Ma- uh, while Mary was walking, the dog chased the air. In this sentence, it prones to misinterpretation. However, the interpretation causes the next word chase to be difficult to integrate into the sentence. Revision and repair processes are therefore called upon to find a solution, which is the case involves recognizing that walking does not need a direct object, so that the dog is actually serving as the subject of chase. These sentences are often called garden path sentences, as the reader is initially led down to the garden path in inter and reading and interpreting them. Thus, the initial interpretation of the sentence while Mary was walking the dog, uh, Chase is corrected to while Mary was walking the dog Chase. The revision or the repair process is reflected in the EPR or the event-related potential components in response to the word that brings the attentions to the problem. The neural basis of this process are still not well understood, though they may depend on partly based on the basal ganglia. It is important to emphasize to that this series of steps is only interpretations of the data. Although Friedrich's model is the best specified neurocognitive perspective, other interpretations have also been proposed. The model have the model proposed by Frederici emphasizes serial sub-process, but also acknowledge that some of these interact in the particular in the last last phase during syntactic and semantic revision and repair. Um, Here, as in word production, models of sentence, which is comprehension, tend to assume either serial processing or interactive processing.